High in the borderlands where snow meets stone, where winds thread endlessly across jagged ridges, the story of Orsinium begins. It is a story that belongs to mountains, to silence, and to the deep memory of the world. For long before armies marched and torches burned, there was simply rock, and within that rock a dream. The orcs, children of Malakath, gathered upon those slopes and valleys where little else dared to grow. They were a people hardened not by choice, but by necessity, born into a life where every stone was both tool and trial. To them, hardship was no enemy, it was a teacher, and so they looked upon the land and claimed it as their own. What others dismissed as barren and cruel, they embraced as sacred. Orsinium, their stronghold, was raised from this devotion. It was no mere city. It was a declaration, a promise made in iron and granite. Each block laid into its walls was a prayer. Each hall carved into the cliffs an act of defiance. Where others cast the orcs aside, they answered with resilience. The mountains may have been cold, but within Orsinium burned a hearth of unyielding spirit. Travelers who glimpsed its rising towers from afar often spoke of the strange beauty it held. Crude, they called it, and harsh, yet there was grandeur in its very bluntness. No filigree of marble, no gentle spires, only fortifications like the shoulders of giants. It seemed less a place built by mortal hands and more an outcropping of the mountains themselves, as though the land had agreed to shelter Malakath as kin. The people who dwelt within Orsinium carried themselves with the same strength. Their voices were rough as gravel, yet in their songs one could hear longing, songs of battle, yes, but also of hearths, of kinship, of a home denied for generations. For the orcs had wandered long in exile, scattered in the shadows of other kingdoms, mocked as beasts, mistrusted as marauders. In Orsinium, they found not only shelter, but dignity. It was more than walls, it was belonging. Yet the mountains know that all things endure at a cost. To raise Orsinium was to draw eyes upon it. The Bretons of High Rock, the Red Guards of Hammerfell, even the distant Nords to the north, they looked upon this fortress with unease. To them, the orcs were not a people carving a sanctuary from stone. They were a threat rising where once there had been only wildness. Fear does not always speak in truth, but it speaks loudly, and already the winds carried whispers of grievance. Still, within those early years, hope reigned inside the stronghold. Children learned to walk upon the same flagstones where warriors sharpened their blades. Cooks prepared meals from whatever meager harvest the mountain slopes allowed, adding warmth to nights filled with laughter. Smiths toiled endlessly, crafting arms and armor not merely for war, but as symbols of pride. To wield an Orcish blade was to carry the story of a people who refused to break. When the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the valleys, fires glowed in the halls of Orsinium like stars fallen to earth. Travelers could see them flickering, golden against the gray, and they knew this was no settlement to be forgotten. It was a beacon of endurance, a reminder that even those scorned by the world could rise. And yet, as the winds circled the peaks, there was always the faint echo of warning. For every stone raised in defiance, there is a hand eager to topple it. Every dream claimed beneath open skies must eventually answer to the restless tide of history. The mountains had granted the orcs a home, but they had also placed it squarely in the path of envy and ambition. For now, though, in this moment of telling, let us linger in the stillness before the storm. Let us see Orsinium not as ruins remembered, nor as ashes scattered, but as it was in its earliest breath, proud, unyielding, alive. A city not yet under siege, a dream not yet broken, the echo of mountains, carrying the promise of a people who would not be silenced. If Orsinium was born of stone, then its soul was fire. Within its walls burned a conviction deeper than any wound inflicted upon its people. To understand the stronghold is to understand the hearts of the orcs, for every archway, every tower, every smoldering hearth was shaped in their image. Their story is not one of gentle rivers or fertile plains, but of storms weathered and scars endured. The halls rang with the clang of hammers against anvils, a rhythm older than kingdoms. Orc smiths, famed even beyond their mountain borders, did not fashion steel as others did. To them, the forging of metal was a sacred act, a communion with the will of Malakath. Each blade hammered into shape was not merely a weapon, but a vow, unyielding, relentless, as sharp in spirit as in edge. When the sparks flew from the anvil, it was as though the mountain itself exhaled, gifting strength to its children. Life in Orsinium, though harsh, carried a strange serenity. The people accepted hardship as one accepts the turning of seasons. Hunger was met with resourcefulness, cold with stubborn endurance. When storms raged across the peaks, families huddled close in firelit chambers, telling tales of gods and ancestors, filling the long nights with words that stitched their community together. There was laughter, too, rough and booming, echoing against stone walls until it seemed the mountain itself might laugh along. The orcs held festivals in their own fashion, not adorned with silks or feasts of plenty, but with strength of spirit. Warriors would test their mettle in contests of endurance, while children played among the carved courtyards, their shouts carrying upward like songs. These gatherings were reminders that even in struggle, there was joy, that even a people scorned could find reason to celebrate the lives they carved from unforgiving stone. To outsiders, these moments were unseen. What the Breton lord or the Red Guard merchant glimpsed was only the stern face of a fortress, the glint of Orcish eyes watching from ramparts. Few entered Orsinium as guests, and fewer still understood its heart. Misunderstanding breeds fear, and fear becomes the seed of enmity. Yet within, the orcs spoke of kinship, of a future not forever hunted, of children who might know peace where their parents knew only exile. But the wider world does not always heed the dreams of those it scorns. Already, murmurs spread in distant courts. The Breton kings wondered if this fortress, so resilient, would one day rival their own keeps. The Red Guards recalled old raids, tales retold and sharpened into grievances. The Nords, whose memory stretches long and bitter, whispered that no stronghold of orcs could rise without consequence. Thus, suspicion began to circle Orsinium like wolves scenting prey. And yet, within the stronghold itself, life continued with quiet dignity. The clang of hammers, the warmth of hearths, the rhythm of daily labor, all carried on as though untouched by the gathering unease beyond the peaks. To walk its streets was to see a people daring to hope, daring to believe that exile might be transformed into permanence. In their songs and their stories, one could hear not despair, but yearning for recognition, for a place in the tapestry of Tamriel that was not stitched with mockery and scorn. This is the paradox of Orsinium, a city both fortress and cradle, both shield and sanctuary. To the world outside, it was a threat. To the orcs within, it was a home. At last, a place where their children could sleep without fear of waking to fire and chains. That dream, so fragile yet so fiercely guarded, gave every stone its meaning, every sword its edge. And so, the mountain kept its vigil. Snow drifted over rooftops, winds howled across battlements, and the fires within burned steadily, defiantly. Orsinium stood, proud against the sky, the echo of mountains given shape. It was a dream of permanence in a world that rarely grants such gifts. Yet even as its walls rose high and its hearths glowed warm, the first threads of fate were already weaving a different design. For history is seldom gentle, and dreams, no matter how strongly built, are forever at the mercy of time. Beyond the mountains of Orsinium, the world did not rest. In the courts of High Rock, in the sun-washed halls of Hammerfell, and in the long houses of Skyrim, whispers carried the name of the Orc Stronghold. At first, it was spoken with curiosity, then with unease, and finally with suspicion. For when a people long scattered gather their strength, Those who have grown accustomed to their weakness take notice. The Bretons of Daggerfall and Wayrest remembered raids along their borders, tales passed down like scars upon memory. Though many such stories were exaggerated, each retelling sharpened the fear. To them, Orsinium was not a home reclaimed, but an army being forged. Every hammer striking steel in the mountain halls became, in their minds, the echo of a coming invasion. Kings counseled with their advisors, lords with their bannermen, and though no orc army yet marched, they prepared themselves as though one already gathered on their doorstep. Far to the south, the Red Guards of Sentinel and their kin in Hammerfell carried their own grievances. To them, the orcs were raiders of the past, marauders of the wilderness, enemies who had spilled blood upon their sands. Old wounds do not heal easily, and the memory of loss, however distant, can smolder like an ember long buried. They watched the rise of Orsinium not as neighbors, but as rivals, convinced that strength regained would soon be turned outward. Even the Nords to the north, separated by snowy passes, gave thought to the matter. Their skalds sang of ancient battles, of Orcish foes felled in long-forgotten wars. To the Nords, every foe remembered becomes a foe renewed, for the sagas are not gentle. They keep grudges alive as surely as they keep heroes. The sight of an Orcish stronghold rising once more was, to them, an affront to victories already won. And so, though divided by culture and distance, these peoples found themselves bound by a single unease. The Breton kings, the Redguard lords, the Nord jarls, each saw in Orsinium not merely walls of stone, but a shadow of threat. That shadow grew larger with every rumor carried by wandering merchants, every tale told by fearful tongues. What the orcs celebrated as a sanctuary, their neighbors saw as a fortress daring the world to challenge it. Yet suspicion alone does not topple walls. Words, however sharp, are only wind unless forged into action. To move against Orsinium required more than whispers. It required unity. And unity in Tamriel is a rare and fragile thing. Still, as the seasons turned, the improbable began to take shape. Messengers crossed borders where once swords had been drawn. Envoys spoke in cautious tones, finding common cause in shared distrust. Old enemies, who might once have clashed upon open fields, now discovered a new purpose in the thought of Orsinium's fall. In quiet councils lit by torchlight, agreements were struck. The Bretons would muster their knights and levies, proud in their shining armor. The Red Guards would bring their swift blades, honed by centuries of war upon the sands. The Nords would march with their raw strength, their axes thirsty for battle. Each people had little love for the other, yet love was not required. A shared enemy, real or imagined, can weave alliances stronger than bonds of kinship. And so, the storm began to gather. Slowly at first, with whispers and letters, then more quickly, with oaths and promises. Like clouds rolling across a vast horizon, the forces aligned, darkening the sky above Orsinium. The stronghold, still alight with its hearth fires, did not yet know how many eyes had turned against it, nor how many blades were being sharpened for its undoing. For now, the orcs dreamed of permanence, but beyond their walls, the world dreamed of war. The alliances that rose against Orsinium were not born of trust, nor of friendship. They were born of necessity, and necessity is often the strongest bond of all. For the Bretons, Redguards, and Nords, to join hands was to set aside quarrels that had burned for generations. Their border feuds, their clashing tempers, their differing gods and customs. None of it vanished, but all of it was, for a moment, quieted by the specter of Orsinium's rise. The Breton lords, cautious and calculating, saw in this coalition a chance to curb a rival before it grew too powerful. Their knights, mounted upon steeds clad in steel, were disciplined and proud, schooled in the arts of both sword and sorcery. The Red Guards, swift and fierce, brought with them the memory of desert wars, their blades curved like the shifting wind. They carried a rhythm of battle that was precise, efficient, devastating. The Nords, towering and unflinching, marched with raw force, their voices like thunder, their axes eager for blood. Together, they formed a host unlike any seen in those highlands before. Each people brought strengths the others lacked, and though suspicion lingered in their eyes, they found themselves bound by a single oath: Orsinium must fall. Yet beneath this vow lay deeper motives. For the Bretons, it was not only fear but ambition. The land around Orsinium, rugged though it was, could provide a barrier against rival kingdoms. To control the mountains was to control the passes, the trade, the movement of armies. For the Red Guards, the motive was pride, a settling of old debts written in blood. For the Nords, it was tradition, an echo of their sagas, a reaffirmation that their forebears had not fought in vain. Each saw in Orsinium's destruction something more than victory. They saw validation of their own place in Tamriel's endless struggle. Messengers rode between cities, bearing promises sealed with wax and steel. Gold was pledged, provisions gathered, roads cleared for armies. Blacksmiths toiled in their forges, priests blessed their warriors, and farmers whispered prayers as they watched their sons don armor. From coast to desert to tundra, preparations stirred, each hammer strike and prayer weaving into a larger rhythm, the drumbeat of war. But alliances are like ice upon a river. Beneath the surface, currents move, unseen yet strong. The Bretons eyed their allies with suspicion, fearing betrayal as much as defeat. The Red Guards measured their companions' resolve, weighing whether the Nords' ferocity might be turned upon them once Orsinium lay in ruins. The Nords, blunt in their thoughts, trusted little beyond the swing of their axes. This coalition was a pact of convenience, and convenience alone. Still, for all their doubts, their course was set. Envoys carried maps of the mountain passes, marking the paths that would lead them to Orsinium's gates. Scouts moved silently, tracing the lay of the land, measuring its strengths and its weaknesses. Plans were whispered over tables scarred by knives and candle wax, each word shaping the destiny of the orcs who slumbered in their stone halls. And through it all, Orsinium remained unaware of the storm's full weight. There were rumors, yes, of movement in distant lands, but rumors are like clouds, shifting, uncertain, easily dismissed. The orcs continued their labors, continued their festivals, continued to dream of permanence. The fires of their stronghold glowed as warmly as ever, not yet dimmed by the shadow stretching toward them. But history moves with patience, and storms do not announce themselves until they are upon you. Beyond the mountain ridges, alliances were sealed, armies prepared, and the march of destiny gathered strength. Soon, the whisper of unease would become the roar of war. Soon, Orsinium would learn that every dream cast into the world draws the gaze of those who would see it undone. The first sound of war was not the clash of blades, but the stirring of armies. It began as a murmur across the kingdoms, like distant thunder rolling over valleys, gathering strength with each passing day. In the marketplaces of Daggerfall, in the sands of Sentinel, in the snowbound streets of Windhelm, the call to arms spread. Men and women left their homes, shouldering spears, fastening armor, and whispering farewells to families who prayed they would return. The Breton knights rode forth beneath banners embroidered with lions and lilies, their steel polished until it gleamed in the sunlight. They moved in orderly ranks, their horses stamping in perfect unison, the air alive with the scent of iron and sweat. Alongside them marched levied soldiers, farmers and craftsmen drawn into the tide of war, their faces marked by fear but steadied by the weight of duty. From the south came the Red Guards, their curved blades catching the light like silver rivers. They moved swiftly, with precision born of discipline, their steps silent as though they marched upon desert sands rather than mountain roads. They carried with them songs of their ancestors, chants that spoke of honor and vengeance, their voices weaving into the steady rhythm of their march. And from the north descended the Nords, fierce and unrelenting. They came in columns that stretched across valleys, their axes glinting red in the dawn. Their war songs shook the air, raw and thunderous, echoing from hill to hill until it seemed the very mountains trembled. Where the Bretons were disciplined and the Red Guards precise, the Nords were wild, their ferocity carried like a storm front ahead of them. Together, these armies formed a tide of steel, rolling inexorably toward the stronghold in the mountains. Along the roads they left their mark, trampled fields, campfires smoldering in the dawn, villages buzzing with the passage of soldiers whose numbers seemed endless. To the common folk, the sight of such multitudes was both awe and terror. They whispered of the war to come, of Orsinium's fate already sealed by the sheer weight of men and arms. Yet beneath the surface of this march lay currents of unease. The Breton knights looked with thinly veiled disdain upon the Nord-Berserkers, whose roaring and laughter seemed too wild, too undisciplined. The Red Guards, proud of their precision, measured both allies with cautious eyes, wondering whether this uneasy fellowship would hold when blood was spilled. Even as their feet carried them forward together, the differences between them gnawed quietly, threatening cracks in the unity they had so carefully woven. But the drums of war beat louder than doubt. Each morning, the horns sounded, and each evening, the camps glowed with firelight. 1,000 sparks scattered across the wilderness. The armies pressed onward, drawn by their shared vow, driven by ambitions and old wounds. And with every step, the mountains of Orsinium grew nearer, their peaks looming like watchful sentinels, indifferent to the mortal tides gathering below. The march of steel was not swift. Roads wound through forests and across rivers. Supplies had to be carried, and soldiers grew weary beneath their armor. Yet the very slowness of the march gave it a gravity, a weight that seemed to echo through the land itself. Villagers spoke of the ground trembling beneath so many feet, of the wind carrying the sound of distant horns. To those who listened, it was as though the land itself was groaning in anticipation of the siege to come. And so, the host advanced, an alliance of unease, a tide of men and steel, a storm still gathering strength. Ahead lay the walls of Orsinium, silent and proud, unaware of how close the shadow had come. The march of the allied host was more than the movement of armies. It was the unfolding of history upon the land. Each footstep pressed into the soil left behind more than a mark. It carried the weight of grudges centuries old, the momentum of choices long made. As the host advanced, villages emptied to watch, elders leaning on their canes, children clutching at their mothers' hands. To them, it seemed as though the horizon itself had split, pouring forth a tide of steel and song. At night, the camps stretched across the wilderness like fields of stars. Fires flickered in long rows, smoke drifting lazily toward the heavens. The Bretons knelt in prayer before polished altars carried upon wagons, invoking the blessings of their divines. The Red Guards sharpened their curved blades by lamplight, oiling the steel with reverence, their voices low in chants of discipline. The Nords roared with laughter, passing mead from hand to hand, their songs loud enough to rattle the branches of nearby trees. 3 peoples, 3 traditions, all bound together for a single purpose, the fall of Orsinium. But even as their songs and prayers rose into the night, the silence of the mountains remained unbroken. Peaks loomed in the distance, their snowy crowns glowing in the starlight, their vast shadows stretching across the valleys. To the soldiers, they seemed like slumbering giants, indifferent to the multitudes that crawled at their feet. Yet in their indifference lay something unsettling, as though the mountains watched and waited, knowing well the fate of all mortal ambitions. The march was long, and with distance came reflection. Some soldiers whispered doubts, wondering if Orsinium truly posed such a threat, if the stories they had been told were but echoes of fear. Others burned with eagerness, convinced that the orcs would rise in conquest if left unchallenged. Between them lay a spectrum of thoughts, from quiet resignation to fiery resolve. War is never waged by kings alone. It is carried upon the shoulders of countless souls, each with their own hopes, fears, and reasons. As days blurred into weeks, the host became a moving city. Merchants followed its trail, selling bread and ale, sharpening tools, offering charms said to ward off Malakath's curse. Blacksmiths traveled with the armies, repairing armor and shoeing horses. Healers tended to the weary, their tents filled with herbs and whispered prayers. The March of Steel was not only soldiers, but the entire machinery of war. The wheels, the carts, the endless flow of provisions that sustained the tide. And through it all, the sound never ceased. The tramp of boots, the clatter of hooves, the beat of drums, the clash of metal being readied. Even in sleep, soldiers dreamt to that rhythm, their minds filled with the steady cadence of an advancing host. It was a sound both reassuring and terrible, reassuring in its unity, terrible in its inevitability. To those who watched from afar, the sight was awe-inspiring, almost mythic. The Bretons, Redguards, and Nords, so often divided by hatred, now moved as one. The world seemed to pause and wonder at such an unlikely alliance, and in that pause lay a chilling truth. If so many could unite against a single foe, what chance did that foe have to endure? Yet Orsinium still rose on the horizon, untouched, unbroken, its fires glowing in defiance of the gathering storm. Within its walls, life continued as it always had. Hammers striking anvils, songs echoing in halls, children laughing in courtyards. The orcs did not yet hear the thunder drawing near, or if they heard, they mistook it for distant storms that would soon pass. But storms do not pass forever. They grow, they converge, and when their weight falls upon stone, the echo is heard for centuries. The March of Steel was not merely a journey. It was the herald of a siege that would shape the destiny of the orcs, the mountains, and all who would remember the tale. At last, the March of Steel met its destination. Rising from the crags of the mountains, crowned in snow and shadow, stood Orsinium, the fortress of the orcs, the dream of Malakath's children given shape in stone. To the eyes of the approaching armies, it was both awe and challenge. Its walls, hewn from the very bones of the earth, seemed less the work of mortal hands and more an outcropping of the mountains themselves. Towers jutted skyward like blunt spears, defiant, unadorned, yet brimming with power. The stronghold did not gleam like the marble cities of the Bretons, nor shimmer with the desert gold of the Redguards. Its beauty lay in its austerity, in the raw weight of its presence. Each block of stone carried the mark of labor, the rhythm of hammers striking in devotion, the sweat and blood of a people who built not for grandeur, but for survival. To look upon Orsinium was to look upon the stubborn heart of the orcs, unyielding and immovable. For those who had journeyed weeks beneath heavy armor, who had crossed rivers and valleys in grim determination, the sight struck deeply. Some soldiers whispered that no force could break such walls. Others spat upon the ground, masking unease with bravado. Commanders studied the fortress with narrowed eyes, tracing its lines, seeking weaknesses in its unbroken silhouette. Each saw the same truth. Orsinium would not fall quickly. Within the stronghold, life continued with a strange calm. From the battlements, Orcish sentries watched the horizon, their eyes narrowing as the dust of approaching armies rose into view. They had long heard rumors, long suspected the envy of their neighbors. Now, the truth marched openly before them. Yet fear did not rule their hearts. Instead, there was a fierce pride, a resolve that shone as brightly as the steel they carried. To defend Orsinium was not a duty, but an honor, and none among them doubted the worth of the struggle. Mothers gathered their children close, teaching them the songs of Malakath that steadied the soul in times of trial. Elders spoke quietly of endurance, of how their people had endured exile, ridicule, and betrayal, and would endure again. Warriors sharpened axes and swords, not with haste, but with reverence, each stroke of the whetstone a prayer for strength. The air within the walls carried tension, yes, but also certainty. They knew they stood at the threshold of a trial that would echo through generations. To the armies encamped beyond, The fortress loomed as a test of patience as much as strength. Siege engines were assembled from timber hauled across valleys, their frames creaking as ropes were stretched taut. Camps sprawled across the foothills, their fires glowing like constellations beneath the looming walls. The Bretons, Redguards, and Nords, so different in voice and custom, found themselves united in one thought. This would be no swift campaign. Orsinium would resist with the fury of mountains, and every victory would be paid in blood. Night fell, and torches lit the battlements, their flames flickering in the cold wind. From the camps below, soldiers gazed upward, and some swore the stronghold itself breathed, its stones alive with the spirit of the orcs. A silence stretched between besieger and besieged, heavy, unbroken, the calm before the first storm. In that silence lay a truth understood by all. The struggle had begun, though no sword yet clashed. The mountains held their breath, and time itself seemed to pause upon the edge of destiny. The silence between the camps and the fortress did not endure for long. On the first morning, as mist clung to the slopes and the peaks shone pale in the rising sun, the drums began. Low and steady, the Breton drums beat like a second heartbeat, echoing through the valleys. Horns of the Nords joined them, their notes raw and thunderous, while the Redguards added their sharp, rhythmic chants. The air trembled with sound, and the stronghold of Orsinium, which had known centuries of quiet endurance, now faced the voice of war. From the gates, Orcish war cries rose in answer. There were not many compared to the armies arrayed below, but their voices carried a force that no number could diminish. Harsh and guttural, yet filled with an unyielding defiance, their cries rolled down the mountainside like avalanches. For the orcs, to stand upon the battlements was to stand upon the bones of their ancestors, to guard not only walls of stone, but the very soul of their people. The first clash came swiftly. Skirmishers from the allied host advanced, their shields raised, their eyes fixed upon the looming gates. Arrows hissed from the battlements, darkening the air, and the sound of steel striking would echoed across the valley. Stones tumbled from high towers, hurled by hands that knew the strength of mountains, shattering the formations below. The skirmishers broke, retreating with cries of pain, leaving the ground scattered with broken shields. But this was only the beginning. Siege engines groaned to life, their great wooden arms pulled back by ropes straining against iron pins. The first stones were loosed, arcing through the sky like dark meteors, striking against Orsinium's walls with thunderous force. Dust and fragments fell, yet the walls held. The fortress, born of the mountain itself, seemed to shrug off the assault, its towers unshaken, its gates unbroken. Cheers rose from the orcs above, their pride swelling with each failed strike. Within the stronghold, life bent, but did not break. Families carried water to the battlements. Smiths mended shields as swiftly as they splintered. Healers tended to the wounded in halls lit by dim fires. The people moved with calm purpose, bound together by the knowledge that every hand, every effort, was a thread in the fabric of survival. Children were hushed to sleep with lullabies of Malekatha's strength, even as the walls shook with the impact of stones. The besiegers pressed on, undeterred. More soldiers advanced, this time in greater numbers, their shields interlocked as they approached the gates. Orcish warriors met them with a fury unmatched, charging down from the gates with axes raised, their roars carrying through the smoke. Steel rang against steel, shields splintered, and the earth drank deeply of blood. For every orc who fell, two more seemed to rise, driven not by numbers but by unbreakable spirit. The armies withdrew before dusk, their dead gathered in silence, their wounded carried back to the tents that lined the foothills. The fortress loomed above them, battered yet unbowed, torches burning defiantly along its ramparts. The first day of true battle had ended, and though the allied host was vast, the strength of Orsinium was revealed. It was not merely a fortress of stone, but a fortress of will. And so, night returned to the mountains, carrying with it the stillness between battles. Fires burned in both camps, their light flickering against the slopes. In the silence, one truth became clear to all who gazed upon Orsinium's walls. This would not be a short war. It would be a test of patience, of endurance, of spirit. And in such tests, the orcs had always thrived. The first clashes gave way to a rhythm far slower, far heavier, the rhythm of siege. Days passed into weeks, weeks into months, and still Orsinium stood. The allied host encircled the stronghold like a tightening fist, their camps spreading across valleys and ridges, their banners fluttering against the endless wind. Yet for all their numbers, for all their machines of war, the mountain fortress endured. Siege is not only the breaking of walls, it is the breaking of time itself. What begins with the roar of battle soon settles into monotony, a waiting game where hunger and patience become weapons as sharp as swords. Soldiers woke each morning to the same gray light, the same duties, patrols, drills, repairs, the endless repetition of preparing for a battle that seemed never to come. For the orcs within, each day was a mirror of the last, gathering water, rationing food, sharpening blades, tending wounds. Both sides learned that endurance, not ferocity, would decide the outcome. Seasons shifted as the siege dragged on. Autumn winds tore across the valleys, scattering leaves into the camps. Winter followed with its cruel hand, laying snow upon tents, freezing rivers, biting into armor. Soldiers huddled around meager fires, their breath misting in the night, their rations growing thinner with each passing week. Within Orsinium, the cold pressed just as fiercely. Families wrapped themselves in furs. Warriors braced against icy winds that cut through stone halls. Yet where others cursed the cold, the orcs bore it with grim acceptance, for hardship was the rhythm of their lives. When spring thawed the snows, hope stirred briefly among the besiegers. New supplies arrived, reinforcements marched into camp, and commanders renewed their vows. Yet Orsinium's walls still loomed, scarred but unbroken, its towers crowned with the watchful eyes of defenders who would not yield. With summer came dust and heat, sapping strength from men and beast alike, yet still the siege continued, the stronghold standing as though carved from eternity itself. Inside the fortress, the orcs lived in a cycle of deprivation and resilience. Food grew scarce, but every morsel was shared, every scrap made a stretch. Children were taught the meaning of sacrifice, their small bellies aching, their eyes still shining with pride as they watched their parents stand upon the walls. Songs carried through the halls at night, not to celebrate victory, but to remind them of who they were, children of Malakath, sworn to endure. In their voices there was no despair, only a deep, steady resolve. For the besiegers, time became a burden. Soldiers longed for swift battles, for the clarity of clash and conquest. Instead, they found themselves in waiting, staring each day at walls that seemed never to weaken. Doubts crept into their minds. If so many months could not topple Orsinium, how many more must pass? Some whispered that the fortress was blessed, that Malakath himself stood within its halls. Others spoke bitterly of kings and lords who sent them to wither in the shadow of mountains while life at home carried on. Yet still, the camps did not break and the fortress did not fall. Siege is a war of patience, and patience can erode even the mightiest stone. Both sides knew this truth, though each clung to it in their own way. For the besiegers, it was the hope that persistence would wear down their foe. For the orcs, it was the faith that their spirit could outlast the hunger of their enemies. And so the seasons turned, the years slowly weaving themselves into the fabric of the siege. The clash of battle had become the silence of endurance, a silence that pressed as heavily as any blade. Yet beneath that silence, history stirred, waiting for the moment when patience would shatter and destiny would demand its toll. The long seasons of waiting pressed down like a second sky, vast and heavy, upon both besieger and besieged. Battles no longer roared each day. Instead, the struggle was measured in hunger, in exhaustion, in the slow erosion of spirit. The siege had become less a war of blades and more a war of endurance, a quiet trial where the victors would be those who could bear suffering the longest. For the soldiers camped in the valleys, the days blurred into sameness. Morning drills, evening watch, endless labor repairing tents and tending engines. Some found solace in prayer, whispering their pleas to gods who seemed silent. Others found it in drink, numbing their minds with a bite of mead or the sting of bitter ale. Yet even laughter, even song, could not hide the truth that gnawed at them. Each sunrise was the same as the last, and the walls above still held. Stories began to circulate in the camps, carried from fire to fire, woven by restless tongues. Some claimed that Orsinium's walls were blessed by Malakath himself, impervious to stone or flame. Others swore that the orcs had tunneled deep into the mountains, drawing strength from hidden wells of magic and forging weapons of unbreakable steel. The truth mattered little. What mattered was the mystery, the sense that they fought not only against flesh and stone, but against something eternal, something that could not be measured in numbers alone. Within the stronghold, the days were no less heavy, yet they carried a different weight. Hunger gnawed, yes, but hunger had always been the companion of the orcs. They shared their food without question, each family giving so that none would be utterly without. Warriors stood their watch upon the walls, their bodies weary, but their spirits aflame. They spoke little, for words were no longer needed. Each knew the resolve of the other. Each carried within their chest the same unyielding fire. Mothers comforted children with tales of Malakath's promise, that to suffer was to be strengthened, that each pang of hunger, each night of cold, was a forge in which their people's spirit was tempered. Elders, their eyes deep with memory, spoke of exiles past, of times when the orcs had wandered homeless across Tamriel, scorned and despised. Compared to that endless wandering, they said to endure within walls built by their own hands was not a burden, but a blessing. The young listened, and though their stomachs ached, they lifted their heads with pride. The seasons turned, and with them the world outside Orsinium shifted. Yet within the siege, time seemed frozen. Snow fell and melted. Harvests came and went. But the fortress still stood, and the armies still camped. The mountains, eternal and unmoved, watched silently, their peaks draped in cloud and shadow. To many, it felt as though the siege would never end, as though they had been born in its shadow and would die there as well. Yet in this strange stillness, a truth revealed itself. Endurance is not empty. Within the long silence, within the hunger and repetition, the spirit is tested, and in that testing, it is refined. For the besiegers, the test was patience, the discipline to remain steadfast, though their enemy defied them. For the besieged, it was the unbreakable faith that their suffering was not in vain, that each day endured was a victory in itself. And so the siege became more than a clash of armies. It became a meditation on the nature of survival, a slow unfolding of will against will. Stone held against storm, flesh endured against hunger, and both sides waited for the moment when silence would break and the struggle would once again thunder across the mountains. Until then, the siege breathed quietly, like a vast slumbering beast, its dreams written in patience, in firelight, and in the silent determination of those who refused to yield. For years the siege had endured, as steady and relentless as the turning of the seasons. Yet nothing in the world is eternal, not even patience. Time, with its invisible hand, began to press harder upon both armies and fortress, carving cracks into stone and spirit alike. What once seemed unshakable now revealed small fractures, subtle but undeniable, whispering that the stillness could not hold forever. In the camps of the allied host, hunger gnawed with sharpened teeth. Supplies, once plentiful, dwindled with each passing season. Merchants no longer traveled so easily into the mountains, for the roads were weary with war, and bandits prowled the valleys. Grain grew stale, meat spoiled, and rations were stretched thin across thousands of mouths. Soldiers who had once marched with pride now muttered in discontent, their eyes hollow, their steps heavy. Some deserted in the night, slipping into forests or vanishing into villages, choosing the unknown over the endless wait. Commanders tried to maintain order, yet even their voices faltered. They promised victory, promised that Orsinium must fall soon, yet the words sounded thinner with each passing month. The great engines of war groaned with age. There was splitting, their ropes fraying, repaired again and again by weary hands. Each time a stone was loosed against the fortress, soldiers watched with less hope, for each strike seemed to leave no lasting mark. It was as though Orsinium's walls were not made of stone, but of the will of its people, and will cannot be shattered so easily. Within the stronghold, the strain was no less severe. Food stores thinned until meals became smaller, then smaller still. Children's laughter grew faint, replaced by the quiet endurance of hunger. Elders gave up their portions so that the young might survive, their bodies growing frail, their voices soft yet steady with encouragement. Still, the orcs endured, for endurance was the marrow of their being. Yet even among them, whispers began to stir. How long could they last? How many winters could be faced with empty bowls and tired arms? Smiths worked tirelessly, melting down broken weapons to forge new ones, mending armor until the metal was thin as paper. Healers rationed their herbs, saving salves for only the gravest wounds. Songs of Malakath still echoed through the halls, but they were sung in softer tones, voices quieter, more reverent than triumphant. Pride endured, but pride was not immune to the weight of endless struggle. The mountains themselves seemed to bear witness to this slow unraveling. Storms grew harsher, winds colder, as though nature mirrored the weariness of those who clung to its slopes. The snow lay heavier upon the ridges, melting late into the year, flooding rivers that cut deep into the valleys. Camps were swept away, walls soaked and crumbled. Yet still both sides remained, bound not by choice but by necessity, for to abandon the struggle was to admit defeat. And so the cracks widened. Neither side could yet break, but both felt the strain. The besiegers questioned the worth of their long campaign. The besieged wondered how much longer their spirit could sustain them. It was as though the siege had become a living thing, feeding upon the suffering of all, demanding more with each passing season. In its shadow, despair lingered, subtle but persistent, whispering to soldier and orc alike that the end must soon come. Yet still the walls stood, and still the camps endured. For though cracks had formed, the stone of will remained. And in that stone lay the seed of the final storm, waiting to be unleashed when silence and suffering could bear no more. Desperation is a subtle thing at first. It creeps softly in whispers and uneasy glances, in the tightening of belts and the lengthening of silences. But as the siege wore on, desperation no longer crept. It declared itself boldly, shaping every breath of those who endured it. The weight of years pressed upon both sides, and the cracks that had begun as faint lines now spread more widely, threatening to shatter resolve. In the allied camps, unity began to fray. The Bretons muttered that the Nords were reckless, wasting food and drink in their loud feasts. The Nords, in turn, accused the Red Guards of arrogance, of hoarding supplies, of caring little for their northern allies. The Red Guard spoke bitterly of both, wondering aloud why Hammerfell's sons and daughters must linger in the cold mountains to fight a war that brought them no glory. At the firesides of the commanders, arguments burned hotter than the flames, each leader questioning whether their people bore more than their fair share of the burden. Desertion grew more frequent. Soldiers slipped away under cover of darkness, abandoning their posts to vanish into the wilds or seek passage home. Patrols returned smaller than they had left, their numbers dwindling like the supplies they guarded. Punishments grew harsher, floggings, executions. But even fear could not bind men whose hope had withered. For what is loyalty when it is stretched across years of hunger and doubt? Yet within Orsinium, desperation took another form. Food became scarcer still. Children grew thin, their ribs pressing against skin, their eyes wide and watchful. Elders fell quietly in their sleep, having long ago chosen to eat less, drink less, so that others might endure. Warriors grew lean, their strength tempered by hunger, yet their eyes still blazed with fire. For every death within the walls, the survivors seemed to draw closer together, as though loss itself bound them more tightly. Still, pride was a dangerous companion. Some orcs whispered that surrender might save the lives of the young, that to yield the stronghold would spare their people extinction. Yet such voices were few, and they were silenced quickly, not by force, but by the unshakable gaze of their kin. To surrender was to betray their god, their history, their very blood. Better to perish upon their walls than to bow to those who sought to erase them. Such was the creed of Orsinium, and though desperation gnawed at them, it could not strip away that conviction. The mountains bore witness to this growing tension, their peaks shrouded in storms, their valleys echoing with the groan of siege engines, the clash of skirmishes, the cries of the hungry. The world seemed caught between two fates, the fall of the fortress or the collapse of the armies that sought it. And in this balance, every day endured felt heavier than the last. Desperation, however, is not only weakness. It is also the spark of change, the breath that stirs the final act when patience can endure no more. Both besieger and besieged felt it, the rising certainty that the long silence of siege was nearing its end. Something would break, something would give, and when it did, the mountains themselves would echo with the sound of destiny unleashed. At last, the long silence gave way to sound. After years of waiting, of watching the seasons circle endlessly, the patience of the besiegers frayed to nothing. Commanders who had once counseled restraint now called for action, their voices sharpened by desperation. To linger any longer, they argued, was to admit failure. And so the host gathered itself like a storm swelling upon the horizon, ready to break against the stubborn walls of Orsinium. The armies moved with a renewed urgency, as though to shake off the weariness of years with one great effort. Siege towers, long idle, creaked forward upon groaning wheels. Battering rams, their heads bound in iron, were dragged toward the gates. Ladders were raised from carpenters' hands, their wood rough but sturdy, destined to bear men upward into the teeth of waiting defenders. The host no longer wished to wait for hunger to erode the fortress. They sought to claim it in fire and blood. Upon the walls, the orcs answered with grim readiness. They had known this moment would come, as surely as winter follows autumn. Their warriors gathered at the battlements, their armor patched and dented, their weapons sharpened again and again until edges gleamed in the pale light. Mothers held their children close, whispering prayers to Malakath, their voices steady even as the air quivered with the march of thousands. To defend Orsinium was to defend not only their lives, but the meaning of their existence. The first stones flew from the great engines of the besiegers, arcing high against the sky before crashing into towers and walls. Dust and fragments rained down, yet the fortress stood as though the mountain itself had chosen to shield its children. From the battlements, Orcish archers loosed their arrows, darkening the air with a storm of feathered shafts. Below, ladders were overturned, siege towers set ablaze with oil and fire, the screams of the burning echoing through the valleys. Still, the armies pressed forward. Shield walls advanced step by step, bearing the brunt of arrows, raising their rams to strike the gates. Each impact boomed like thunder, shaking stone, sending vibrations deep into the hearts of those within. Yet the gates held, their timbers iron-bound, their hinges forged by smiths who had poured both sweat and spirit into their craft. The defenders upon the walls roared with pride, their voices carrying above the clash, defiant as the mountains themselves. The day stretched long, each moment heavy with the weight of history. Blood stained the snow at the foot of the walls, mingling with splintered wood and shattered stone. Yet when the sun dipped low and the armies withdrew, Orsinium still stood, its fires burning, its people unbroken. That night, both sides sat in silence. In the camps, soldiers tended wounds and buried their dead, their hopes shaken by the strength of the fortress. Within the walls, the orcs lit their halls with torchlight, their songs low but steady, carrying the rhythm of endurance. Though the storm had broken, though blood had been spilled in rivers, the stone of Orsinium still resisted the tide. And in that resistance lay the promise that the storm was only beginning. The first assault did not bring victory, nor did it break the fortress, but it lit a fire that neither side could quench. The besiegers, unwilling to accept failure, returned the next day, and the day after, each morning marked by the pounding of drums, each evening by the retreat of the wounded. What began as a single storm became a cycle, a ceaseless rhythm of attack and defense, of blood spilled upon the stones, of cries rising into the cold mountain air. Siege towers rolled again toward the walls, their hulking frames swaying under the strain of ropes and wheels. Orcish defenders hurled flaming pitch from above, turning the wooden giants into pyres that lit the valleys for miles. Rams struck once more against the gates, each blow echoing like thunder, yet still the timbers held, splintered but unbroken. Arrows flew in endless arcs, until the ground itself seemed to bristle with shafts, and still the fighting raged. For the orcs, every defense became an act of devotion. They fought not merely to hold their walls, but to honor the generations who had long been scorned, exiled, and betrayed. Each stone cast down upon the enemy was a declaration that their people would not bow. Mothers stood beside warriors upon the battlements, carrying buckets of water to quench flames, or hurling rocks when arms grew weary. Children carried messages through the halls, their small feet swift across the stone. In Orsinium, every hand, young or old, was raised in defiance. Yet the toll was heavy. Wounds accumulated, food dwindled further, and exhaustion pressed like a leaden cloak upon the defenders. Still they endured, their pride fierce, their unity unbroken. Songs were sung not in triumph, but in solidarity, their voices echoing through the fortress at night like the heartbeat of a single living being. To live in siege was to live in sacrifice, and the orcs embraced it as their truth. In the camps below, weariness and anger mingled in equal measure. Soldiers who had once believed in swift conquest now cursed their lords, asking why they must bleed so endlessly upon stones that refused to yield. Yet their commanders pressed them onward, fearing that a falter now would undo years of sacrifice. Pride drove them as much as duty, the pride of kingdoms unwilling to admit defeat to those they had long called savages. Days became weeks, weeks into months. The assaults never ceased entirely. If not by day, then by night, skirmishes flared in the shadows, arrows loosed in darkness, fires set against the gates. The valley became a graveyard of splintered ladders, burned towers, and broken bodies. Snow fell upon them in winter, grass grew around them in spring, yet the relics of struggle remained, silent testaments to the relentlessness of both sides. Still Orsinium endured, its walls scarred, its people weary, yet the stronghold stood, its fires burning defiantly against the endless tide. And as each assault faltered, as each day ended with the fortress unbroken, the besiegers felt the weight of futility pressing more heavily upon them. They had thrown storm after storm, and still the mountain stood. But even the strongest stone cannot endure forever. Cracks widened, timbers weakened, and behind the proud songs of defiance lay a truth none could deny. The storm was not finished. It gathered still, heavier and darker, waiting for the moment when walls, will, and flesh alike would be pushed beyond their limits. The mountain fortress had endured storms beyond counting, but even the strongest stone begins to yield beneath endless strain. After years of fire and steel, of ceaseless blows against its gates and towers, Orsinium began to show the first signs of true fracture. What had once seemed eternal now trembled, not in surrender, but in the weary truth that nothing forged by mortal hands can endure forever. The great gates, which had withstood countless rams, groaned with every new strike. Their iron bands bent inward, their hinges shrieked like wounded beasts. Each blow of the ram echoed through the stronghold, felt in the bones of every child, every elder, every warrior who called Orsinium home. Cracks spread like spiderwebs across stone towers, small at first, but widening, as though the mountain itself sighed beneath the burden of war. Within the walls, the orcs saw these wounds as clearly as their enemies, yet they did not despair. Instead, their resolve deepened. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder at the gates, ready to meet whatever breach might open. Smiths worked day and night, reforging broken armor, patching cracks with hastily set mortar, mending what could be mended. Mothers carried water to quench flames. Children fetched stones to hurl from the battlements. Elders sharpened weapons for younger hands. The fortress lived as a single body, each part moving in harmony, each heart beating with the same defiance. In the camps below, the Allied commanders sensed the shift. Their patience had nearly run dry, their soldiers weary from years of struggle. But the cracks in Orsinium's walls gave them new resolve. The Bretons spoke of destiny, of how their divines had at last blessed the siege. The Nords roared in triumph, eager for the glory of battle. The Red Guards, ever disciplined, pressed their lines with renewed precision, determined to see the campaign concluded. For the first time in many months, hope stirred among the besiegers. The assaults grew fiercer, no longer probing, but relentless. Siege towers pushed forward in greater numbers, their frames shielded by walls of shields. Ladders rose in waves, soldiers clambering upward into a storm of arrows and fire. Rams struck without pause, day and night, until their iron heads glowed with the heat of constant friction. The valley thundered with effort, the air thick with smoke and dust, as if the very world shook beneath the struggle. For the orcs, each day became a final stand. They fought with a ferocity born not of hope for victory, but the certainty that their lives, their history, their very name depended upon endurance. Songs no longer carried joy, but solemn power, voices low and steady, binding each warrior to the next. They knew the breaches would widen, that the gates would one day fall, but they also knew that every moment of defiance was a triumph in itself, a gift of memory to generations yet unborn. The mountains watched in silence, their peaks hidden in storm clouds, their valleys filled with the cries of men and mare. Snow fell upon fire, fire melted into smoke, and still the siege pressed on. Breaches had begun, but the soul of Orsinium remained unbroken. And in that soul lay the last defense, the final strength that would carry the fortress into its darkest hours. The first breach came not with a single thunderclap, but with a slow, grinding surrender. Stone, battered by countless blows, split and fell away, sending fragments cascading into the dust below. A section of the outer wall crumbled, its once proud surface now a jagged wound. Through the haze of smoke and falling debris, the besiegers surged forward, their cries rising like a tide. The defenders met them at once. Orcish warriors, gaunt from years of hunger yet fierce as ever, rushed to the breach with axes and spears. The clash was immediate, violent, and close. No longer separated by wall or gate, the two sides collided in brutal intimacy, shield against shield, blade against bone. The breath of one enemy fell upon the face of the other. The mountain echoed with the roar of struggle, with the clang of steel and the cries of the fallen. The besiegers fought with desperation, for they sensed victory at last within reach. The Bretons pressed forward in disciplined lines, their shields raised as a wall of steel. The Nords charged with reckless fury, their war cries rolling like thunder, axes swinging wide. The Red Guard struck with precision, blades darting swift and deadly in the narrow breach. Together, they poured into the gap, determined to tear it wider with each heartbeat. But the orcs did not yield. They fought as though each stone behind them was a child, a mother, an ancestor whose spirit they must protect. Their strikes were heavy, their roars terrible, their bodies unshaken by wounds that would have felled others. They fought in pairs, in groups, covering one another, dragging the injured back only to see them rise again, refusing to abandon the line. The breach became not a weakness, but a crucible, a forge in which their spirit burned brightest. More breaches followed. Another tower collapsed under the relentless pounding of rams and stones, sending clouds of dust billowing into the sky. Flames licked at the walls, smoke curling into the mountain air. Yet each opening was met with the same defiance. Orcs rushed to every weakness, filling gaps with their bodies, with their blades, with their unyielding will. Inside the stronghold, chaos churned. Families gathered deeper within the walls, clutching their children as the sound of battle drew nearer. The wounded lay in rows, their breaths shallow, their eyes still burning with pride, even as their strength ebbed. Smiths, their forges long exhausted, now took up arms themselves, wielding hammers not to shape steel, but to break it against the enemy's skulls. The stronghold itself seemed alive, every hall and chamber filled with the pulse of resistance. The besiegers, though vast, paid dearly for every stone gained. Bodies piled in the breaches, soldiers slipping on blood-slick ground, the cries of the dying mingling with the crash of collapsing stone. Victory, so close at hand, revealed itself as costly beyond measure. Yet still they came, driven not only by orders, but by pride, by rage, by the unwillingness to turn back after so many years. Night fell, and still the breaches smoldered, torches casting long shadows across ruined walls. Neither side claimed triumph, for the battle raged without conclusion. The orcs had not fallen, though their fortress now lay wounded. The besiegers had advanced, yet their dead lay thick upon the ground. Between them stretched only exhaustion, and the certainty that the morrow would demand more blood, more fire, more endurance than ever before. The years of siege had built to this moment. Orsinium, scarred and battered, stood upon the edge of collapse. Its walls, once unyielding, now bore wounds too deep to mend. Cracks ran like rivers across stone. Towers leaned with uneasy weight, and the gates groaned with each passing hour. Smoke hung heavy in the air, the breath of a fortress slowly being consumed. Yet within those walls, the spirit of the orcs burned fiercer than ever. The besiegers sensed the end drawing near. Their commanders spoke in urgent tones, promising their soldiers that the final push was at hand. Bretons whispered of glory and divine justice, their knights eager to carry their banners over the broken gates. Nords sharpened their axes and roared their readiness, eager for the honor of slaying the hated foe. Red guards tightened their ranks, their discipline as steady as the desert wind, their blades gleaming in the torchlight. Together, they braced for one last storm, one last fury to break the stronghold of the orcs. Inside Orsinium, the people prepared as if for a sacred rite. Every hand was set to purpose. Warriors bound their wounds with strips of cloth, raising their weapons though their bodies trembled with exhaustion. Elders sat with children, whispering words of strength, teaching them the songs of Malakath so that memory would outlast the walls themselves. Mothers clasped daggers, ready to stand beside their kin in battle. No corner of the stronghold was silent, no heart untouched by the gravity of what lay ahead. The orc chieftains gathered in the torchlit halls, their armor dented, their faces lined with soot and blood. They did not speak of surrender, nor of escape. Such thoughts found no root in their hearts. Instead, they spoke of duty, of legacy, of the meaning of their people. To fight was to live, even if death came with the rising sun. They swore their oaths to Malakath, their voices low but unwavering, a promise that the enemy would pay dearly for every stone, every breath, every life they sought to take. When dawn broke, the mountains shook beneath the renewed assault. Rams struck the gates in unending rhythm, a drumbeat of destruction. Siege towers lurched forward, their wheels groaning, their frames scarred by fire, yet still advancing. Arrows darkened the sky, a storm of steel that fell upon the battlements without mercy. Orcish defenders answered with their own volleys, their arrows tipped in fire, their spears thrust down into the press of bodies. The clash became deafening, a tide of sound that drowned even the cries of the wounded. The gates at last began to split. With each blow, timbers groaned and iron bands tore free. The orcs pressed their weight against them, straining to hold the barrier with their bodies alone. But wood and flesh alike could not resist forever. Cracks widened into gaping wounds, and through them, the enemy's eyes gleamed with hunger. The breach was coming, inevitable and terrible. Still, the defenders did not falter. Songs rose once more, low and resonant, echoing through the halls like the heartbeat of the fortress itself. Voices joined in unison, a hymn of defiance that filled the stone with power. It was not a song of hope for survival, but a vow that their spirit would endure even in ruin, that Orsinium would never be forgotten. And as the gates shuddered, as the walls trembled, as the final storm gathered upon the horizon, the orcs stood ready, not as a broken people, but as a flame burning bright against the endless dark. The sound came like the breaking of the world itself. With one last thunderous strike, the gates of Orsinium tore apart, their shattered timbers flying inward in a storm of splinters and smoke. Iron bands snapped, hinges groaned, and the barrier that had held for years was no more. Into the breach surged the allied host, a torrent of steel and fury rushing like a river unleashed. The orcs met them head-on. Warriors charged into the opening, their roars echoing through the stone halls, their weapons swinging with desperate strength. Axes bit deep, spears thrust forward, shields locked in defiance. The first ranks of the invaders fell in heaps, trampled by those behind them. Yet still the tide came, endless and unrelenting. Within moments, the battle spread from the walls into the very heart of the stronghold. Streets became killing grounds. Narrow alleys choked with bodies. Torches lit fires that raced across rooftops. Smoke turned the sky into a shroud of ash. Every corner was contested, every doorway defended. Families who had once tended hearths now fought for survival with whatever weapons they could grasp: daggers, stones, even their bare hands. The fortress was no longer only a home, but a living battlefield, each chamber echoing with the clash of steel. The Bretons pressed forward in ordered ranks, their shields raised to block arrows from above. They advanced step by step, planting banners in the very streets, as though already claiming the ruin as their own. The Nords stormed through in wild fury, their voices carrying above the din, axes crashing down upon Orcish defenders with brutal force. The Red Guards moved with ruthless precision, their curved blades flashing in arcs of silver, cutting down all who stood before them. Together, they filled the stronghold with fire and death. Yet the orcs did not falter. For every street lost, another was barricaded with carts, stones, and bodies of the fallen. Warriors fought to the last breath, refusing to yield even when surrounded. Mothers fought beside sons, elders beside grandchildren, their defiance burning brighter than the flames devouring their homes. Songs of Malakath rose amid the chaos, voices hoarse yet steady, a final litany of resistance carried into the smoke-filled air. The stronghold itself seemed to resist alongside its people. Walls cracked, but did not fully collapse. Towers leaned, yet still gave shelter to archers who rained arrows upon the invaders. Even as fire spread, the stone glowed with defiance, as if Orsinium itself refused to fall quietly. Every street, every chamber, every gate became a shrine of sacrifice, marked by the blood of those who defended it. The battle stretched into night, torches casting flickering shadows across shattered walls. Still the fighting raged, neither side willing to yield. The invaders held numbers and momentum, yet the defenders held spirit unbroken, each stand fiercer than the last. The clash was no longer measured in ground gained or lost, but in lives, in the unyielding defiance of a people who chose death before surrender. As the moon rose above the smoke, Its pale light fell upon the burning fortress. Orsinium was aflame, its streets red with fire and blood. Yet within that fire burned the heart of the orcs. The gates had fallen, the enemy had entered, but the last stand had only just begun. The end came not in silence, but in fire. By the time dawn broke again, Orsinium was a city of smoke and ruin. Flames leapt from rooftops, their orange glow painting the stone in shifting light. Towers that had stood for generations crumbled, their stones crashing into the streets below. The once mighty walls lay torn and gaping, shattered by the weight of years and the fury of unrelenting assault. The mountain fortress, so long a symbol of defiance, now shuddered upon the edge of destruction. Through those flames, the invaders pressed on. The Bretons advanced with their banners raised, each step forward declaring dominion over the stronghold. The Nords bellowed their victory cries, their axes slick with blood, their voices echoing against the broken walls. The Red Guards moved like flowing rivers of steel, carving paths through the streets with disciplined precision. Together, they filled the city with the sound of conquest, a terrible chorus of triumph and destruction. Yet even as fire consumed their homes, the orcs did not yield. Warriors fought from fallen towers, leaping down into the press of enemies with weapons raised. Families barricaded chambers, hurling stones and boiling oil upon those who forced entry. Archers shot from windows until smoke choked them from their posts, blades flashing even in the last moments of breath. The stronghold had become a pyre, and its people the flames themselves. The air was thick with ash, each breath a struggle. Smoke cloaked the sun, turning day into a dim twilight. The cries of battle mingled with the crackling of fire, the weeping of children, the roars of warriors giving their last. No corner of Orsinium was untouched by the storm. Its great halls, once filled with song and story, now echoed only with the clash of steel and the collapse of stone. Its streets, once paths of kinship, ran red with blood. Still, the defenders pressed onward. For them, each strike was not meant to save themselves, but to carve memory into the world. They knew the fortress would fall, yet in their hearts lived a deeper truth. Orsinium's spirit was greater than stone, greater than walls, greater even than life. To fight, to resist, to refuse surrender. That was their victory, even in ruin. The besiegers saw it too. Though their numbers carried the day, they marveled at the ferocity of the defense. For every 10 men who entered a street, half might not return. For every tower seized, countless lives were spent. The cost of conquest grew heavier with each heartbeat, until even victory felt like hollow triumph. Yet still they pressed on, for pride forbade retreat, and vengeance demanded completion. By nightfall, much of Orsinium lay in ruin. Fires raged unchecked, painting the mountainside with an unholy glow. The sky itself seemed aflame, reflecting the ruin below. And yet, amid that devastation, the songs of the orcs still rose, faint but unbroken, carried by hoarse voices into the smoke. They sang not for survival, but for remembrance. They sang so that even as the fortress crumbled, its spirit would endure, echoing across Tamriel for all ages to come. At last, the walls gave way. The final towers collapsed in a storm of stone and flame, sending echoes rolling across the mountains. The streets of Orsinium, once filled with voices of kinship and laughter, now ran only with fire and silence. What had been a stronghold of unity, a dream carved into stone, was reduced to ashes before the eyes of the world. The siege, so long and so merciless, had reached its dreadful conclusion. The invaders poured through the ruins, their banners lifted high above the smoke. Bretons claimed victory in the name of their kings, their cries sharp with pride. Nords roared as if the mountain itself had yielded to their strength. Red Guards advanced in disciplined silence, their blades still gleaming even in the half-light of ash. Yet behind their triumph lay exhaustion, and beneath their cries of conquest lay unease. For they had broken the fortress, but not the spirit of its people. The orcs fought until the very last. Warriors clashed in burning halls, their axes striking with the weight of generations. Mothers shielded children with their bodies. Elders stood defiant even as flames consumed them. Songs of Malakath rose one final time, raw and hoarse, each note a vow that their defiance would echo long after death. And though the last defenders fell, though their blades grew still, their spirit remained unbroken. As the fires burned, survivors fled into the wilderness, scattered families, wounded warriors, children carried upon weary shoulders. They moved into the forests, the mountains, the hidden valleys of Tamriel, carrying with them fragments of memory, shards of hope, and the unyielding promise that Orsinium would rise again. Though the stronghold had fallen, the people lived, and through them the dream endured. The besiegers left behind a ruin. The stones of Orsinium lay blackened and broken, towers shattered, gates torn apart. Yet even as they departed, even as their songs of victory faded into the distance, the mountains seemed to whisper with the voices of the fallen. For every stone was marked with sacrifice, every hall sanctified by defiance. The ruin itself became a monument, not to defeat, but to endurance. And so the story of Orsinium did not end in fire. It carried forward, whispered in the winds, remembered in the songs of wandering orcs. The siege became legend, a tale told not only of loss, but of unbreakable spirit. Where others saw ruin, the orcs saw a promise that one day their walls would rise again, stronger than before, forged by fire, bound by blood, and sanctified by memory. Thus the siege of Orsinium passed into history, not as the end of a people, but as the beginning of their eternal defiance. For stone may fall, and cities may burn, but the spirit of a people, unyielding, unbroken, can never be destroyed.